today we will be discussing property rights, more specifically the general libertarian perspective on property rights and the pollution dilemma, how that plays into the conversation. So I'll start with a short background on libertarian theory of property, and then we'll discuss more informally afterwards. Property rights are a socially enforced construct that delineates who owns what goods and resources, that is, who can use what goods and resources. We exchange, buy, and sell existing property rights, or property that is already owned, and a principle to acquiring ownership of previously unowned property is called the homestead principle, which is the basis of many libertarian philosophies, but the interpretation of it varies among different philosophers. Basically, by appropriating or making use of previously unowned resources, you then acquire ownership of those resources. John Locke, in his theory of property, included what we call the Lockean proviso, which states that we have the right to homestead unused property by working on it, as long as we leave enough and good enough for others, which is quite vague. And there's also the Rothbardian idea of easement rights, meaning that the homesteader also has the right to pollute or be annoying, and when someone moves in next to them, they can't force the original party to stop polluting because they've homesteaded the property, and that comes with pollution rights. So why do libertarians value private property rights? Well, a peaceful and conflict-free society is, in my opinion, impossible without private property. Every individual person has his or her own independent goals in life. We have a limited amount of goods and resources, and each person may want to use these resources in different ways to achieve his or her goals. And without boundaries on which goods each person is allowed to use, conflicts will only be resolved by coercion. And this goes against basic libertarian values of autonomy and individualism. And of course, capitalists believe in the power of private property to promote economic growth and prosperity, because owners of private property have incentives to maintain its value and put it to productive use. So private property, basically the difference between anarcho-capitalism and anarcho-socialism. Now I'll go over a little bit how pollution affects property theory. And in my opinion, your individual take on pollution may vary based on your take on libertarianism, whether you have an economic consequentialist model or an absolutist model based on first principles. And most libertarians do have some combination of both views, and most will probably argue that they're inseparable. But for the sake of this description, I'd say that a libertarian, a pure libertarian absolutist argument against regulating pollution is that, like much other regulation, it is a coercive act and violates the polluter's autonomy. And many, especially consequentialist libertarians, are also against regulating industrial pollution because it is usually the byproduct of economic productivity. And because of anti-regulation arguments like these, libertarianism is often accused of being anti-environmentalism. Human activities, when unregulated, often produce negative externalities on the environment, like pollution from factories and vehicles, which affects individuals and whole communities. And a plausible libertarian response to this criticism that many of us often give is that upholding strong property rights solves negative externalities like pollution, which, and pollution is considered a violation of property rights in some cases. So just as we believe that individuals shouldn't be forced to contribute to a greater good through taxation, for example, we also should believe that we should not violate a property right, even for the greater good of overall economic productivity. As you can see, this goes against the earlier intuition I built up to be against regulation of pollution. And from this respect to property rights, I personally come to a difficult conclusion. If we want to have an absolute commitment to property rights and the non-aggression principle, it seems that this commitment will go way too far in the direction of respecting the environment, so far that it would render living in society impossible. many libertarians and anarchists may disagree and argue that pollution cases can be resolved privately. And that's true for smaller cases, like neighborly disputes can potentially be resolved with homeowners associations or some other form of local contract. However, participating in a society where you don't have an explicit contract with every other person in the society results in there being victims of unwanted pollution. Like the property of landowners and foresters may be the distant victims of industrial pollution. And everyone breathes in airborne pollutants, which affects them physically. Even loud noises physically affects everyone's eardrums. Everyone also emits carbon dioxide and maybe bad smells and unwanted noises and other things that could be considered pollutants. And insofar as we consider climate change or global warming as a threat or violation of property rights, libertarianism has to account for those violations. But in cases as general as climate change, we can't identify all the individual perpetrators and victims. So a lot of people will have a problem with me being so absolute for those relatively small cases of pollution that can't be resolved privately. Why can't we assume implicit consent or assume that people don't care about minor amounts of pollution? Well, this is dangerous because libertarians, and I guess more particularly anarchists, tend to be absolute on other forms of aggression, like taxation. If there's no acceptable level of taxation, why should there be an acceptable level of pollution? And anarchists also tend to be against the idea of an implicit social contract with the government, especially when people explicitly do not consent. So even though I'm directing this dilemma more towards anarchists to internally resolve, the upshot is that it's tough for the individualist in general. You know, today's environmental problems like climate change and pollution is the result of many, many individuals, and it's really, really tough to figure out the affected actors, who should work things out with whose liberties we're allowed to sacrifice, etc. So here's where I'm going to end the presentation, and we can start discussing potential solutions and, I don't know, disagreements with anything I've said.